Hello, WorldCiv. This is week 5, I believe, and so I hope you guys all had a great holiday. I just want to point out something just to remind you. You know, a lot of you, most of you, are doing great, and this is an overwhelming amount of information. Last week I think was really hard because there were sections that didn't even really go together in any way. This is just the problem of cram courses for this, which I mentioned in my first announcements for this class. And so I just want to acknowledge that. So what I want to suggest, and if you notice the way that I set up this class, you don't need to memorize all this information for any kind of exams or quizzes. So what I think you should do, for those of you who actually want to learn in this class, is just, think about, as you go through, I'd like you to learn it all in one sitting, but just, I want to remind you to look at little bits and pieces and think about what might be best for you, in terms of actually getting something to kind of keep mentally for yourself. Now, what I want to also say is that this week's information does all go together. It is so important for you to understand. And when I mean important, I mean everything that I'm going to talk about in all the lectures and the videos that you're going to see affect everything that's happening right now. It has a link to the modern world and what's happening in this history that I cover. This is probably one of the most significant sections that affects everything that permeates your life politically here in the United States and the rest of the world. But for all of my students here in this class, really, this affects everything. Because we're talking about World War I. We're going to go into World War II, talk about the Spanish Civil War a little bit, and prior to that, we're going to talk about the communist revolution that takes place in Russia. And my God, look, I'm a child of the Cold War. I grew up under the fear of Russians, but it was not just Russians themselves. It was the idea of communism. There's almost nothing that I can even compare to the paranoia and the kind of it was acceptable for everybody to be anti-communist. Now we don't have any equivalent to that. So now the best equivalent could be whatever one thinks of this, radical Islam. Well, we have a lot of, I have a lot of friends that are Muslim that are not a part of this. It becomes a more complicated narrative to try to talk about what you're dealing with right now and on a social level, because we're talking about a world religion and a certain set of political ideas that are coming out of that are responding to a whole lot of other things. We'll talk about that at another time. Much more complicated. But the Cold War is very straightforward. But even then, I don't know how many Americans ever even knew what communism was, to be honest. Look, when Barack Obama was president, how many times did I hear on AM radio that he was a socialist or a communist? I just want to say, if you think that he was a socialist or a communist, you've been polluted by a ridiculous political ideology. All the socialists that I knew wished that he was. What you can argue is that the Democratic Party as a whole does implement ideas that do come out of a socialist tradition within the democratic world. So this is a little bit complicated then, right? So what's the difference between socialism and communism? And what do we make of the fact? Just for example, at the end of World War II, when the Britain was completely devastated by the war, it was a Labour Party who established socialist medicine for the first time in the UK at a time that they were very anti-communist. Okay, so just as an example, There's so many things that I want to say about all this, but I also hope that as you explore this, that you contact me this week if you have questions or you want me to elaborate on something, because this may help clarify a lot of what's going on politically now. I mean, the whole issue of dealing with North Korea, which again we'll talk about more later, is again a byproduct still of this past that we've had to deal with. And I also just want to say this one thing too, that sometimes not only do most Americans misuse the term socialism and communism, they also misuse the term fascism, another ideology that ends up coming out of the World War II era. There's a lot of nuance between a populist movement and a fascist, another term throwing out there. And you know, in America, we have two political parties only. This is not the case in Europe and many other countries, other democracies. If you want to really participate in politics, you know, you're not going to be in the... I mean, the Green Party's got a little percentage. There's other parties. I mean, we can legally have different parties, but really the only two parties that actually really do anything in this country, it's the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Republicans are always accusing the Democrats of being communists or socialists or some sort of liberal problem, the loony left, as they call them. And many in the Democratic Party accuse Republicans of being fascists or far right-wing. Here's what's interesting. If you are, let's take somebody who is a real fascist, a neo-Nazi. Now I'm going to do this both ways, so just listen to everything I'm saying. So if a white nationalist or a neo-Nazi, a KKK, since they also can only pick two parties to participate in, which one are they going to pick, the Democrats or the Republicans? If you go to a Republican rally, a convention, a conservative convention, there will be Nazis or KKK there, okay? That's what's going to happen. That's what happens. Now, on the other hand, if you're a communist, I mean, there are people who actually still believe in communism. The Communist Party endorsed the Democratic Party it is Communist Party USA. It's just one Communist Party. For decades has endorsed Democratic candidates. So if you go to a Democratic convention, there will be people that are communist or have communist sympathies. Do you get where I'm going with this? I mean, fascism has a tradition that comes out of right-wing conservative politics, despite what you're hearing about fascism and socialists being the same thing. We could talk about that another time too. There's so many things I want to cover. That's also misleading. There's a reason for that, but it's misleading. And then you have, from the Democratic side, because there are social programs, you have the far left that are going to be there. So in other words, when either side accuses the other side of having particular, more what the mainstream would consider extreme ideas in them, they're going to probably be right. And this is a byproduct of the Cold War, but it's also a byproduct of our limited representation in terms of our system. Not having, I mean, so for example, you have like Christian socialist parties in Europe or other places where they have morally conservative positions and liberal economic views. We don't really have the equivalent to that. So something like that here. So anyways, I hope I'm not confusing you and I'm at least kind of drawing something to your attention for you to think about. And so I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm just going to stop here. So pay attention to this week's material very carefully. And again, contact me if you have any questions. And I hope you guys have a great week.